Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair, staring at the fluorescent lights above him. They buzzed like a constant, unyielding hum, one that seemed to penetrate deep into his skull. It was late, far later than most of his colleagues would ever work, but that was part of the job. The bureau didn't exactly run on a 9-to-5 schedule. The sleek monitors before him displayed rows of data, names, faces, encrypted messages, and terrorist activity reports, but his focus wasn't on the text. No, Ethan had a different skill that set him apart from every other agent in the room. He could sense lies that he didn't know exactly how it had started. Maybe it was the training, maybe it was genetic. Some scientists said it was a heightened version of intuition. To Ethan, it was something far stranger, something like a sixth sense. The lie would tingle in his chest first, then spread across his skin like an electric charge, making his hands tremble. He would feel it in the air around him, a distortion, a crack in the fabric of truth. Tonight, the screen in front of him flickered. The live feed from a terrorism operation was just about to update. A new development was coming in from one of his informants embedded in a terrorist cell. Ethan felt the familiar electric sensation shoot through him as he scanned the details. Agent 1324, Hassan al-Mikdadi. He listened to the voice on the wiretap, his heart rate steady. Hassan was a small-time operative in a much larger network, but he had proven reliable before. The voice crackled in his ear, speaking in Arabic. "There is a bomb," Hassan's voice told the agent. "It will go off in less than 4 hours. It is in Washington, D.C. I know where it is." Ethan's muscles tensed. The lie hit him like a slap to the face. No, that's not true, he thought. He's lying. That it wasn't a subtle lie. It was bold and clear. The bomb. Ethan felt the words twist, the falsehood rippling like waves in his chest. Washington, D.C. He couldn't shake the feeling that Hassan was being fed information. He was lying, or at the very least, covering for someone else. Ethan didn't waste time. He tapped a few keys, flagged the message, and sent an alert to Director Whitaker's office. Director Whitaker's office was a different world altogether. Unlike Ethan's dimly lit room full of monitors, her space was pristine, decorated with expensive furniture and lit by soft, ambient light. Whitaker didn't do ugly when it came to work, and Ethan had learned to respect that. She sat behind her desk, her face bathed in the soft glow of her computer screen. The phone buzzed, and her eyes flicked to the alert Ethan had sent. "Cole," she said, glancing up with an unreadable expression. "What have you got?" "I don't trust him," Ethan said without hesitation. He didn't need to explain further. Whitaker was one of the few people who understood him, understood his ability, and the toll it took. She leaned forward, hands clasped together. "You're sure?" "Positive," Ethan replied, his voice firm. The moment he mentioned the bomb, it felt like a lie. He's covering for someone. Director Whitaker didn't react immediately, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them. She was calculating, as always, weighing options. "Get confirmation," Whitaker said at last. "I want to know who he's working for." The next hours passed in a blur of investigations, intercepted messages, and frantic radio calls. Ethan's ability had become invaluable to the Bureau. He could read a suspect's intentions before they even spoke. He could spot inconsistencies in a report, or a hidden truth behind a casual remark, but as he worked, the buzzing in his head grew louder. "What if I'm wrong?" he thought. "What if I'm starting to see lies that aren't really there?" The more time passed, the less certain Ethan became about what was true and what was false. At first, it had been clear. The lie would stand out, almost like a physical force. But over the years, the edges had started to blur. There was a time, not too long ago, when he would have been certain of his instincts. Now, everything felt off. Even something as simple as a conversation with his partner, Lila Marquez, began to feel laced with deceit. She had stopped by his office earlier, asking if he needed anything. "Anything I can do to help?" she had asked, her voice light, casual, but Ethan could feel the lie in the air. There was something more there, something hidden beneath her words. He had almost asked her about it, but then stopped himself. Was he overthinking it? Was he starting to distrust everyone around him? He couldn't afford to trust his doubts. The stakes were too high. So, instead, he pushed it aside and focused on the mission. The lie, the bomb, the terrorists, he could handle them. In the days that followed, Ethan's ability to differentiate between truth and deception began to unravel further. His mission was a success. Hassan's lie had led them to a false location, but the repercussions of his growing uncertainty lingered in his mind. By the time he received his next assignment, Ethan was no longer sure of himself. The Bureau had been monitoring an international meeting between diplomats, suspected of discussing plans to destabilize the U.S. government. It seemed straightforward enough, an opportunity for Ethan to prove his worth once again, but as the meeting unfolded in a secured room, Ethan's doubts began to grow. He listened in, sensing every shift in tone, every fluctuation in speech. He could feel the lies like ripples on the surface of a pond, distorted and far-reaching. Lie. Lie. Lie, but something didn't sit right. The lies were too obvious, too perfect. It was like watching a performance, one that he could see through, but didn't know how to stop. And then, there was Ambassador Reyna, a foreign diplomat with an impeccable record. She spoke with an air of authority, her voice steady and confident. But Ethan could feel it. She's hiding something. The lie was buried deep within her words. He knew it, he could feel it, but he couldn't place it. He reported it to Director Whitaker immediately. But to his surprise, she brushed him off, giving him only the faintest of acknowledgments. "We'll look into it," Whitaker said, her voice cool. "But the mission's primary focus is on the broader agenda. Don't get sidetracked, Cole." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Reyna's words echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. The lies had become more insidious now, hidden beneath layers of truth. He didn't know whether he was losing his touch, or if the lies were becoming more sophisticated. The following weeks were a blur of missions and briefings, each one more draining than the last. The voices, the lies, they all seemed to bleed into one another. By now, Ethan couldn't trust anyone, not even his own senses. Was he losing himself? Was his ability really a gift, or was it a curse? More than ever, the world seemed like a twisted, unrecognizable place, where every smile, every gesture, and every word was a potential deception. He had to know. He had to find the truth. But who was telling the truth anymore? Ethan didn't even trust himself. Ethan sat in the darkness of his office, staring at the flickering screens in front of him. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, in fact. He could almost hear his own thoughts racing, each one louder than the last. He ran his fingers through his hair, tugging slightly at the strands, trying to ground himself. The hum of the fluorescent lights above had become an aggravating companion, echoing in the background as if it were a metronome marking the passage of time. The minutes stretched on, longer than they ever should. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for anymore. The lies had blurred everything. There was a new report on the screen, an incoming file from an operation that had just wrapped up. It was routine, data encryption intercepted, terrorist communications analyzed, the usual. But as the report came in, a strange chill ran through him. His eyes flicked to the timestamp on the screen. 9:32 p.m., the time didn't matter. But what followed, what his mind had already begun to anticipate, did. The target is in New York City. The operation will be executed at dawn. It was the phrasing that set his nerves on edge. Will be executed. The certainty of it, like a promise. Ethan's senses flared. The lie, slick and sharp, spread through him in waves. It wasn't the usual deception, the simple half-truths he had grown used to, the kind he could untangle like thread from a spool. No, this was something more complex that he didn't need to look at the source of the message to know who it was. The pattern was all too familiar. The file had come directly from one of the operatives, a trusted agent whose track record was spotless. someone who had never failed to deliver accurate information. But here it was again, another lie. It crawled beneath his skin, knotting in his stomach. The operative's voice in his mind, telling him everything he needed to know, and none of it true. His heart beat faster, the electric buzz of deception thrumming through his veins. Ethan rubbed his eyes, shaking his head. It was happening again. The lines were blurring, and he could barely tell where the truth stopped and the lie began. Had he made a mistake? Was it possible that this time, for once, the source was genuine? Maybe he was just paranoid, reacting to the tension of the job, to the weight of the endless pressure. No. That wasn't it. He had learned to trust his senses above all else, to let his body guide him when his mind failed. And it was screaming at him now, warning him that the truth was being buried beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The problem was, it wasn't just the operation that seemed off. It was everything. The more Ethan thought about it, the more the people around him seemed to wear their lies like comfortable clothing. He had seen it in their faces, in their eyes, familiar colleagues who smiled at him with hollow warmth, pretending they didn't notice the cracks forming in his perception. Lila had stopped looking at him the same way. Her glances had become quick, furtive, like she was afraid of being caught. Was it guilt? Or had she simply learned to recognize the signs that something wasn't quite right? Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the mission, to hone in on the details that mattered. There was a bombing scheduled in New York. He had to stop it. His mind was still sharp enough to know that, even if the rest of his instincts were becoming unreliable. The bomb was real. The threat was real. He couldn't afford to question everything. Not now, but even as he turned his attention back to the details of the mission, his eyes fell on the list of names. The suspects. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, and he needed to connect the dots before it was too late. He clicked on the file of the primary target, Viktor Zarkov, a name that had appeared in intelligence reports more than once, but never linked to a concrete threat. Zarkov had been a ghost, a phantom hiding in plain sight, and yet here he was, at the center of this latest conspiracy. Ethan studied the file, watching the holographic image of the man flicker across the screen. Viktor Zarkov, a known arms dealer, with connections to various terrorist organizations, but then the sensation hit him again. The lie. The lie that lingered in the air, thickening with each word. Zarkov's file didn't match up. Ethan couldn't explain it. Something about the way the data was presented, the way the language was framed, it was designed to make him believe. But his senses screamed at him, rejecting it. This is manipulation. For a moment, Ethan just stared at the screen, torn between what his instincts told him and the facts before him. It was a lie, he knew it. But he couldn't figure out why, or how. Was it all an illusion? A trap designed to make him question everything? Director Whitaker's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp and clear, as if she were standing right next to him. We're moving forward with the plan, she said over the comm. Zarkov is the priority. The operation is greenlit. We need you on the ground in New York. Now. Her tone was firm, unyielding. She didn't wait for a response. Just the brief click of the line cutting off, and then the silence enveloped him again. He took a deep breath, trying to force his racing thoughts into submission. His role was clear. He was the best at this. He could detect the lies, expose the truth. The Bureau relied on him because they trusted his abilities, except he wasn't sure if he trusted himself anymore. Ethan grabbed his jacket, the cold leather feeling like a weight on his shoulders. He had done everything he could to prepare for this moment. He had trained for years to be the best. But now? Now, everything felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. He wasn't sure if he could even trust the people around him, much less the orders coming from the top. His thoughts spiraled as he stepped into the elevator, descending to the level where the transport was waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led into something far darker than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back. The operation was already in motion. New York was a city like no other, and the buzzing energy of it was all too familiar. Ethan was on autopilot as he made his way through the streets, his senses alert. His team was in place. The target was close. Zarkov had been tracked to a high-rise, and the information they had suggested he was preparing for a final exchange. The trap was set, but even as they approached, the nagging feeling in the back of Ethan's mind intensified. "This doesn't feel right," his earpiece crackled, and Director Whitaker's voice came through, calm and commanding. "We've received confirmation that Zarkov is the target. He's the mastermind behind the plot. You have authorization to take him down." The order was clear. Simple, but Ethan didn't move. His eyes scanned the building, the people moving in and out of the area. He watched them, his gift kicking in, sensing the undercurrent of lies that ran through the crowd. And then it hit him that it wasn't Zarkov who was the target. It was never Zarkov. He could feel the lie, so thick and pervasive it nearly suffocated him. Everything, the briefing, the mission, even the agency itself, was a setup. A lie that had been carefully constructed for him, for his ability to sense deception. But what was the truth? Who was pulling the strings? As the truth came crashing down on him, the lie finally became clear. And for the first time, Ethan realized he had been chasing shadows all along. His senses had betrayed him, his gift, his curse, had led him to a point of no return. Ethan felt the weight of the lie settling over him, the truth pulling away like a distant star fading from view. It was the first time in his career that he didn't know where the line between truth and deception began. He couldn't see the edges anymore. Everything was a blur, his thoughts, his mission, his mind. As he stood in the middle of the bustling New York streets, the sound of traffic, pedestrians, and distant sirens seemed muffled, distant. The world around him moved, but he felt detached from it all, like he was watching through a fogged-up window. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every person passing him by was somehow connected to the web of lies he'd been caught in. He wasn't hunting the truth anymore. He was hunting shadows. The air felt thick with the weight of his growing uncertainty. Was it Zarkov? Was it the agency? Or was it himself? His thoughts spiraled, but the buzz in his head, the hum of deceit, was a constant companion, louder now than it had ever been. It was suffocating. The lies, the whispers, the hidden truths were all coming at him from every angle, forcing him to question everything he had ever known. Ethan had always been sure of his ability. It was his gift. His curse. He'd been taught to trust it above all else. But now? Now, he wasn't so sure. Every time he trusted his instincts, the lies grew more insidious, more tangled. The deeper he delved into the truth, the further it slipped away from him. As he stepped into the elevator of the high-rise, he couldn't shake the thought that he was walking right into the heart of a trap. His earpiece buzzed again, Director Whitaker's voice cutting through the static. "Ethan, we're tracking Zarkov's movements. He's on the top floor. Proceed as planned." There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. Just a sharp, calculated command. But something about it unsettled him. The certainty with which she spoke, it didn't match the unease clawing at him from within. He could feel her words like a hand on his chest, pushing him further into a spiral he couldn't escape. "I understand," Ethan replied, his voice steady, though it felt like his own words were slipping out of his control. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He knew the building like the back of his hand. His team was already in place, waiting for his signal. They had the location. The target was close. It should have been simple, smooth, clean, but the buzz in his ears was deafening now, and his mind was clouded with doubt. The lie was so thick he could taste it on his tongue. He had walked into this mission with certainty, with the kind of confidence only a man who had never doubted his senses could have. Now, everything was a question. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't about him. This was about stopping the attack. This was about doing his job, no matter how much it hurt. He had always prided himself on being the one who could get the answers. The one who could cut through the lies, but now, he was afraid of the truth. With a quick glance at his wristwatch, Ethan keyed in the entry code, and the door slid open. He stepped inside, the dim light from outside spilling into the otherwise dark room. There were no sounds. No movement. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow him whole. Zarkov was nowhere to be seen. Ethan moved further into the room, his every sense on high alert. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the oppressive silence was louder than any scream. He flicked on the lights, his breath coming faster now as he scanned the room for any sign of the target. Then, the door behind him slammed shut with a sudden force, and Ethan spun around, his body immediately on guard. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and his senses flared. The lie was here. It was everywhere. There, in the corner of the room, standing by the window, was someone he had never expected to see. Director Whitaker. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mouth went dry. She was supposed to be in the safe house. Out of the operation. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, watching him with a look of quiet amusement in her eyes. Ethan couldn't finish his sentence. The weight of the moment made it impossible to form coherent words. She smiled at him, but it wasn't the smile he was used to. It was colder, sharper. Almost triumphant. Ethan, Whitaker said, her voice low and calm, did you think you were the only one who could see the truth? His stomach dropped. The room felt smaller now. His chest tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I've been waiting for this, she continued, her tone almost playful. I knew you would get to the truth eventually. I just didn't think it would be this soon. Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't process what she was saying. The pieces weren't fitting together. His senses were on fire, screaming at him, warning him. This isn't right. She's lying. But what if she wasn't? What if everything he thought he knew was wrong? What if Whitaker had been playing him all along, just as much as the terrorists had? Why? Ethan forced the word out, barely able to breathe. Why would you do this? Why would you lie? Whitaker's eyes flashed with something darker, something colder. Because, Ethan, she said slowly, as if explaining to a child, you were always too good at your job. Too good at hunting the truth. But now, you're just like everyone else. You can't see it anymore. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. His mind was reeling. The lies, the ones he had uncovered, the ones he had been trained to expose, were part of a larger game, a game he didn't even know he was playing. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. Everything I've done, Whitaker continued, her smile widening, everything you've done, has been for the same purpose. To make you question everything you know. To break you down. To make sure that, in the end, you'll always be asking, is this real? Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He felt the lie closing in, swallowing him whole. He wanted to speak, to shout, to demand answers, but his voice failed him. The weight of the truth, or the lie, was crushing him. He didn't know which one it was anymore. Director Whitaker stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. She didn't have to say anything else. Ethan could see it in her eyes. The game had always been rigged. And now, he was the last piece. He had been the perfect agent, the perfect tool. But in the end, he wasn't the one uncovering the lies. He was the lie. The room around him seemed to fade as his mind shattered, the walls closing in. The world was nothing but deception. He couldn't trust anything, not his senses, not his thoughts, not even his own heart. And as the darkness consumed him, Ethan realized that, in the end, the lie had always been within him. It had always been part of who he was.